This isn't just something of sitting around waiting for God to drop some holy cloud around you so that all of a sudden all of your lust goes away. No, this is a discipline. The fact of the matter is, when you read scripture, it's up to us to stand up and be men. What? Fight great battles, live great adventures, defend the beauty in our lives, our wives, our kids. I mean, that is our role as men in this world. And if we're not going to fight big battles and live great adventures, especially in this area of sexual sin, I don't know how we end up maturing our manhood. We need big battles to fight. We need great adventures to live, or we never do mature as Christians. And part of that is our effort. Part of that is choosing to say, I'm going to be like Christ or die trying.
Fred, why does marriages not heal a porn addiction? And how did that show up in your life almost 30 plus years ago?
Yeah, I mean, the reason why it doesn't is because really, our wives are not just interactive, warm, inflatable dolls. I mean, they've got their own desires, they've got their own needs. Sometimes they're sick, sometimes they're chasing kids all day, they're too tired. And for one thing, it's not like we always think that once we get married, oh man, we're going to have sex all the time. That isn't how it is. The other reason is that a lot of our habits are based upon ourselves, the way our brains have been altered by porn, that sort of a thing. So, um, the habits that we have before marriage, we bring into marriage. And when I say habits, I mean medicating some of our wounds, medicating some of our stress with porn and masturbation. If we do that before we get married, we're going to do that afterwards.
Yeah, and I think one thing I've always said is porn is like if you're struggling with purity, you're struggling with compulsive or addictive behavior around porn and masturbation. You have to understand that porn is not the problem. Like porn has become a solution to how you're handling problems in your life, and marriage is not going to solve that problem. If anything, and maybe this is something that you've experienced, is oftentimes the marriage becomes the magnifier on these things. Has that been something you've experienced with men that you've worked in? It's like once they get into that relationship, that marriage, it really begins to escalate itself.
Yeah, it's not just men I've worked with, and it's in my own life. The thing is, my dad was a national wrestling champion. He was a AAU national heavyweight wrestling champion, and he was bigger than life. And but he never really accepted me because I wasn't a wrestler. I was actually an outstanding football player, but he never really accepted me, and I wasn't the kind of guy he liked. I mean, he liked cocky guys that likes to go get drunk and take women to bed. He wanted to do that with me as I grew older, and that just wasn't who I was. And so, my dad never really accepted me as a man. I never really felt like I fit into the world of men back then, and I sure do now, but at the time I didn't. And so, as I dealt with some of that pain and some of the stress that comes from that, uh, it's like most sexual addictions counselors will tell you, the next window of opportunity to learn about your manhood, if your dad doesn't help you with that, is in your sexuality. And I jumped through that window completely. And I used women to try to find my manhood. And of course, it doesn't work. And then obviously, the porn, the masturbation, that doesn't heal anything. It doesn't heal any wound at all. It's just like what you said. It's basically a solution, a medication that helps us get by in the moment, but it doesn't change anything deep down. And so, as I went into marriage then, and you talk about the magnifiers, I mean, I was a terrible leader, spiritual leader, when I first got married. I thought that men were to lead and women are to submit, and, she was supposed to become just like me. She didn't look at it that way. And so, we had a lot of stress early on. And of course, the more stress you have in your life, the more you then run to masturbation and other sexual kinds of sensual viewing of, whether it's girls on beaches, walking down the street, in parking lots, wherever. Your eyes are moving, and then eventually you're masturbating again, medicating that pain in your life. So uh, eventually, my wife helped me with that because I realized where a lot of that action was coming from, and I began to deal with the actual issues underneath it all. I also understand, Frank, that, in my own life, when I first got married, I was in full commission sales. And that always means one thing: if you don't sell something, your kids don't eat. And I was under a lot of financial stress back then. And again, I dealt with a lot of my financial stress in the same way through the sexual sin. And, my wife really helped me learn how to turn my financial stress over to the Lord and how to be more of an active Christian in terms of connecting with the Lord, having intimacy with the Lord, and kind of bringing my problems more to Him than taking things into my own hands with sexual sin.
Yeah, I really appreciate your vulnerability there, Fred, with talking about the relationship that, how the relationship with your father played a massive role in kind of leading you down this path. I'd love to maybe circle back here a little bit and kind of talk about if and how you were able to maybe heal that relationship. But two things I want to kind of hone in here right now. You talked about when you were early on in your journey, like you were in a commission-based sales, and a lot of time that brings a lot of stress, right? Got a lot of guys that are going to listen to this that are really driven, these high performance A type personality. That's who I am. That's who I attract. A lot of our guys are out there trying to build companies, build businesses, maybe in the early stages of entrepreneurship, right? So they're dealing with the stress, right? If we can identify that the way that we deal with stress oftentimes is through these sexual outlets, but we're trying to get free. How did you overcome that? And what role did your wife? So two-part question here. What role did your wife play in helping? Maybe attack your overcoming of that stress and other outlets that you found. And then we'll kind of touch in on the role your wife played there as well.
Yeah, well, a lot of people know that I've written two books. One was Every Man's Battle, and one is Battle On, Battle Over, which are kind of a 1-2 punch in dealing with these issues. Every Man's Battle dealt with our first vulnerability in our sexuality, which would be our eyes and our mind, where we can draw sexual gratification through our eyes and mind. We can lust over those things, and that's where the chemistry comes that really medicates our pain. I worked really hard on getting my eyes under control. Once truly engaged the battle, and the Holy Spirit led me to make a covenant with my eyes and to begin to really guard my eyes so that I'm not bringing in all that pollution, all that medication. Um, what happened after that, Frank, is that I thought the battle would be over at that point, but that's not how it was. I thought that as I stopped bringing in that sensuality, that's it. I mean, I thought that was the entire battle. But what I found was that in my full commission sales, a lot of times I would be out in front of people selling during the day. Then I'd be with my family in the evening. But I would have to have some time to do the paperwork, some time to do the hard work of planning, vision, all that. And I'd do a lot of that later at night. And when I would go back to my office, even though my wife was 6 blocks away in my house, and if I would have driven 6 blocks, and if it was a sex issue, she would have just said, fine. She loves sex. I love sex. I mean, we had a great sex life. And the thing that was really confusing to me, though, I would go to my office and I would masturbate, which is something I just really didn't want to do. And yet it seemed like the only thing to do. And so what I was finding is that, okay, so I'm here at my office. I could have sex, but it was weird. I was using my sexual apparatus with the masturbation, but it didn't seem to be a sexual issue, and it was confusing to me. And so, what I did is I started to just do a real assessment, self-assessment, and real men, especially type A men like you're talking about yourself. Me, I mean, I've been type A my whole life. I've built businesses, so I understand all the guys out there that you're dealing with. I get it, okay? But one of the things I found was I needed to do a deep self-assessment. What is causing me to trip like this? And I just couldn't figure it out. So as I began to really look at what was causing me to fall, I began to notice that real tight tie with the financial stress. And the nights that my financial stress was the highest, those were the nights I would find I would masturbate. And then on the nights where I felt doubting that I belonged in the world of men or that I was ever going to actually create a great business, those were the times where I would find myself masturbating. And so as I began to think about that, something struck me for the first time in my life. And, you know, no, back then, I mean, people weren't even talking about this issue. And so I had no one to really go to. But this is the thought that occurred to me. There is a sexual sin, a type of sexual sin that is not sexual at its root. It's not because you're not getting enough sex at home. It's not because you're overheating your sex drive through your eyes. It's something else. And there is such a thing as non sexual roots to your sexual sin. That blew me away, but it was a huge turning point for me. And here's the thing that I found through the years, Frank, is that most men never connect those dots. Okay, this is what they say to them. So this is a self talk. I masturbated again. I have no self will. I'm a rotten Christian. I'm a pervert. That's sort of how they begin to talk about themselves. When in reality, they're not a pervert at all. They just have high financial stress. They're dealing with it with their sexuality, but they're not a pervert at all. In fact, they're not rotten Christians at all. They just can't, they just haven't connected the dots. Once you connect the dots, this thing dies pretty quickly because what I began to do is I began to take, okay, when I would be under high stress at work and financial stress, I would take that to the Lord in prayer instead of taking it in my own hands with lotion and a towel or something, right? And I know I'm being very transparent, but I mean, that's just really how it is. And on the nights that I'd feel really rotten about my manhood or whatever, you know, gosh, I was a great athlete. I played baseball at Stanford. I mean, I lived that dream, and yet, because my dad never really accepted me, I struggled with that. And so I would take that to the Lord. And the way I dealt with that one is that when we are digging into porn and masturbation, we are actually looking for oh, just a connection and intimacy. It's a false intimacy, but we're looking for some sense of control, manhood, belonging, that sort of a thing. And what I began to do is I began to actually get more tight with the Lord in my intimacy with Him. And we can talk about this if you like. It's in chapter 6 of Battle on, Battle Over. But I began to do a lot of one on one worship with the Lord where I would go into my basement every day at the beginning of my day and I would sing 3 or 4 songs to Him and just out loud sing one on one. You are altogether lovely. You are beautiful. You are all that I need. They almost have a romantic sound, but it's not. It's worship. But the thing that I found is that I began to connect so deeply with the Lord that that false and he kind of just by connecting with me, I began to have that sense. Yeah, I really am a man. He loves my manhood. He loves, and he says I belong in his world of men, and that's where it began to really heal. So again, what it comes down to is healing the underlying wounds, or at least dealing with them in a more effective way with God.
Yeah, no, I love all that, man. And Fred, here we are, we're recording episode 214. I started this podcast a little over 4 years ago in July of 2019 as a byproduct of my own journey. I struggled for 20 plus years, got on the other side of it, saw the world completely different, really felt connected for the first time to who I was, right? It's like who God made me to be. And, talking about all the business, the leadership, the personal training that I'd done, it's like I felt equipped like to articulate a message, but also maybe lead others out of this. And God has been very fortunate and really blessed everything we've done over these 4 years. But what's awesome to me, man, is we've got dozens of conversations with guys just like yourself, right? That struggled, got on the other side. And every single time there's all these parallels. For me, it was that deep intimacy with Christ, and it was getting close and finding my faith. And I had those same experiences, man, where I would blast worship music first thing in the morning. It was like, God, I felt so alive and so connected. So I love hearing all of that, man. And I'm so glad that you talked about that. Oftentimes our struggles with pornography, our struggles with lust are not the same as a sex addiction. I think so many guys will be like, yeah, I got to watch porn because I got this high sex drive. Or don't they think like, I watch porn, I'm struggling with it, so I'm a sex addict. And I've had enough conversations with young men that have never had a real sexual experience, despite our struggling with pornography addiction, that I've always seen them separately. Is that how you see it as well? Like there are some people that maybe are sex addicts, but there's also this whole other realm over here with guys that maybe aren't sex addicts. It's more compulsive around porn. It's more, they can't handle the stress. Like, has that been how you've seen things as well?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, gosh, that's so interesting you said that because when I was first writing Every Man's Battle and trying my first book, which was 2000, the year 2000 it came out, but I was writing it 98. 97, 98. And the very first book on sexual addiction that ever came out was called Out of the Shadows, and it was a secular book. It was written in 1992. So, I mean, when I'm writing this book in 97, 98, I mean, there just hadn't been almost anything written on this. And I remember reading in Out of the Shadows, I mean, the way he measured things, he had levels, level one, level two, level three, and he was talking about literal sexual addictions. But already at level one, it was homosexuality. I mean, it was some pretty heavy stuff already at level one. And I thought to myself, most men don't live at level one, two, three, or four. Most of them live somewhere between zero and one, which I then dubbed the phrase fractional addiction because it's kind of a fraction of one. I mean, and where most guys live is they're dealing with just general male stress, general father wounds, which so many people have. I mean, you think about the fact that, 50% divorce rates for decades. And, there's tons of guys growing up without a fatherly influence where they can have any kind of strength drawn from their fathers. And, it's a lot of those guys that are dealing with that through masturbation, but it's not really what I would call deep sexual addiction, the kind of addiction that you need maybe years of counseling to kind of get through. Now, most guys just need to put the dots together and understand, okay, what's driving this weird thing in me? I don't want this. I don't even want the masturbation. I don't want the porn. I don't want any of it. And yet it seems to compel me. That's a different thing than addiction.
Yeah, no, that's oh wow, that's great, man. How do you define addiction then? Like, do you have a textbook definition that you kind of run to, or is it kind of case dependent, individualized?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that, I mean, Patrick Carnes wrote that first book, and honestly, I don't think that his definitions of actual sexual addiction are all that far off. I mean, when you go and read what he's talking about, and I can't even remember it fully because the people I deal with, I don't have to really deal with that level of addiction. But I mean, there were levels where guys then are going out and, you know, picking up hookers, whatever it might be. And then there's some that, I mean, it's pretty dark stuff where, you are dreaming of rape and going out and working these things out and living them out in some kinds of play acting. I mean, it's just a bunch of stuff that's pretty heavy. But most of the people I deal with, they're just saying, okay, like I had one guy came to me, his name was Logan, and he called me on the phone and said, Fred, hey, can you meet me at Starbucks? I mean, there's a problem I have that I think you can help me with. Well, ever since Every Man's Battle came out, no one ever invites me to Starbucks for anything other than sexual sin stuff, right? I mean, nobody's going to say, hey, Fred, can you help me learn how to deal with my finances? No, it's always sexual sin because I'm kind of the sex guy, so to say, ever since that book came out. And, he was talking to me and he was saying, look, I was free of all this for 10 years from my teens up until now. I think the time he was 28, he had just started a business, and he's turned out to be an amazing businessman, type A, all that. And but suddenly he was back into masturbating and looking at porn at night, and it was always in his office. Well, his office happened to be in his apartment. His wife is 6 steps down the hall, and she just loves sex. I mean, he could have always had sex, but again, it was a non-sexual issue. And what we found out for him was that, okay, why would a guy who for 10 years has been free, why would he all of a sudden be back into it? Well, he had started a new business. Um, it wasn't going all that well at first. It's hard to start a new business. And financially, he told me he was only 3 weeks away from burning through all his savings and having to basically let his kids starve. And, I told him, look, I don't think you have a sexual sin issue. I think you have a financial trust issue. And he looked at me like a coconut had fallen on his head from 20 feet. He really did. And deer in headlights, he barely knew what to say. But I began to explain how male sexuality is built and how we use things like masturbation and porn to deal with those stresses. And literally, within a month to 6 weeks, all the masturbation, all of that was gone. Because once he connected the dots and he understood why he was running in that direction, it's just a matter of, again, turning it back to the Lord like I had done when I was young and turning back to the way men deal with battles. Instead of running, and medicating, real men stand up and fight. And that's what he did. He didn't even focus on the masturbation, he just focused on the way he was dealing with the financial stress, and then it was over. So, um, for me, getting back to your original question, for me, having what would you say, a good definition of addiction, it's usually not even in the conversation. The guys I deal with, they just want to get free. They don't care. I mean, I can look at him in the eye and say, "Look, you don't have an addiction. Look, you're dying here. You think your kids are going to starve?" And I asked him, "Okay, how are you feeling as a man?" He said, "I don't feel like a man at all. I can't even support my family." Well, see, that's the issue. And so I just help guys with the issues underneath. And I think that, 99% of the people you're going to deal with, Frank, it's the same thing.
No, and this has been the case, man. And I love the frame here that we're kind of setting up. It's realizing like when we don't see ourselves as complete, as whole, as maybe worthy, if we have this like less than type of view perspective for who we are, then it's like, well, duh, let me just go self-sabotage. Let me just go do the things that I know I'm not supposed to because I don't really care that much about myself. Like if you did everything for yourself on a daily basis that you truly deserve, like you wouldn't need pornography, you wouldn't run to it at the end of the day. If you took care of your health, if you took care of your relationship, if you focus in on the finances, right? Like, so yeah, this is so powerful. You're talking a lot about financial stress though. Like, do men specifically or people in general, like, do we handle and process financial stress differently than other stressors in our life? All right, guys, we'll get back to the episode real quickly, but I wanted to remind you of today's sponsor. Today's episode is brought to you by Legendary Men's Care. Is your toothpaste attacking your manhood? Probably. There's new science that demonstrates store-bought toothpaste may be linked to lower testosterone levels. Now, here's the catch 22. You got to keep your mouth clean, right? Poor oral hygiene is linked to low T and erectile dysfunction. But at the same time, big paste and natural paste options are packed with feminizing, manhood killing ingredients that crush your confidence. Now, men swallow this stuff every single day when we brush our teeth. No wonder testosterone levels have declined every decade since the introduction of these harsh chemicals in our everyday products back in the 1950s. Now, what's a guy to do? Up until now, there were no options. Yet, with the brand new legendary Men's Care toothpaste bundle, you can clean your teeth, brighten your smile, and freshen your breath with the only toothpaste carefully crafted just for men. Free of harsh, kick to the nut chemicals found in store bought paste, and safe from hippie oils and popular natural branded toothpaste that cause increasing moobs. For a limited time, you can get free shipping on your next order of legendary Men's Care toothpaste, plus an additional 10% off when you use the coupon code REBUILD10. Again, guys, go to legendarymenscare.com right now. Get free shipping plus an extra 10% off your order when you order today with coupon code REBUILD10. Let's get back to today's episode.
Oh, I haven't really thought of it that way, Frank, but I would say that um, financial stress, well, you can look at the statistics. When you look at exit interviews of people leaving their marriages, financial stress is usually 3 to 4 times happening more often than, say, some of sexual problems would be number 2 or 3. In-law problems would be number 2 or 3. It kind of depends on when you're taking the test, but the financial issues are always at the highest. And if we're honest, most of us get married, you'll have a tightwad who marries a spendthrift or whatever, and so until you guys can learn to work together on finances, there's problems. And then, of course, a lot of guys, once they get married, James Dobson, I know people don't know him as well today, but when I was growing up, say, in the Lord between my 20s and 40s, he was the guy on the radio who was talking about manhood and how to be men. And he used to say that guys, they really don't even formulate their dreams very well until they get married and they have wives, and essentially everything is hanging on their shoulders, and where they need to get up, visualize their visions, and get out and make it happen. Okay, and so once you get married, you're just really in a position where you're working hard to kind of move things forward. And usually finances are always a big part of the early difficulties of building a business. That everybody knows that. And so yeah, there is a lot of stress, and that is at the root of a lot of sexual sin. Now, all of it, heavens no. Most of us start our sexual sin in our teens. And it's the stress in high school, it's the stress in college, whatever. You start to form your habits that way of running to sexual sin to deal with your pain. But then when in your 20s and 30s, when you're building a business and financial stress hits, your brain already knows where to go for medication.
Yeah, I have a great friend. We've had him on the podcast here twice now, Tony DiLorenzo, who runs really powerful ministry podcasts, and they've gotten into books and authorships and coaching now on the relationship side. He talks about these 6 pillars of intimacy, one of them being financial intimacy. Like every marriage, every relationship should have dedicated weekly time. Maybe it's every Sunday you sit down, you talk about the finance. You say, where are we at? Where are we spending money? What are we budgeting for this week? What are we budgeting for 90 days? But it's like such an focused part of so many relationships. And then, like you said, you get to the end of it and it's like, yeah, we got divorced because the husband wasn't providing or our finances blew up in front of us. Where if we were proactive about these things, talking about them on a regular basis, it's going to bring you closer because you're talking about some of the most important things in your life and you create real deep intimacy. But then you're not going to be blindsided down the road when 3 months down the road, babe, why are you spending $200 every week at Target? You know, we don't have it. Well, we haven't had these conversations. So such a key factor there. I love that.
Yeah, and Frank, that's really why financial stress becomes such a common cause of sexual sin. People aren't talking,
Yeah,
just the
they
way
just
it
brush
is.
it under the rug. Just brush it under the rug.
Yes,
Oh, it'll take care of itself. Oh, it'll take care of itself. Oh, it'll take care of itself. You stop focusing on things long enough, they're not going to solve themselves. They will blow up down the road somewhere.
exactly.
Um,
You're right on target.
yeah. What year was it when you actually got free?
It depends on how you look at it. In terms of my eyes, where I had those under control, that would have been probably 86, 1986. It would take some time before I, got that evening masturbation situation taken care of because it took me a while to even figure that out. But it's been well over 30 years now since I've masturbated. It's been over 30 years since I've gone onto, say, television or computer or any of those sorts of things to look for something lusting to lust over. Okay. So, people wonder sometimes, okay, is this even possible to be free? I can look you right in the eye and tell you, yeah, well, it's over 30 years since I've even gone online to even like in my heart, I'm saying, oh gosh, I want to find something to lust over. I don't even do that anymore, let alone masturbate. So, and then I've got 2 sons who have never masturbated, and those guys, they don't, they're better than I am. I mean, they never even got trapped. So, people, can you pass it on to your kids? Well, absolutely. But you have to be intentional. It's just like you said with the finances. Okay. If it's once a week, fine, however you do it. But if you're having the conversations, so much changes. And with my boys, I know you're an athlete, right? And you're into health and keeping your body strong. Well, back in high school, he wanted to be a Division I football player, and he did meet that goal. But in 8th grade, he asked me, Dad, can you teach me how to lift weights? Well, for 5, 6 years, we were lifting weights together, and having all kinds of conversations about sexual things because you're in any club, there's all sorts of women dressed very inappropriately, and he's asking how I deal with those things. And boy, the conversations made us extremely close. I'm not sure I know of any son that's any closer to his dad than I am with him, Michael.
God, that's beautiful, man. I definitely want to circle back there because I know we have a lot of men out here that are fighting their own, fights right now, but they also got little ones that they're raising. I want to be able to pass some of that on. But the reason why I asked the date, right, is because you talked about you started writing Every Man's Battle in 97, 98, and there wasn't a whole lot of conversation. Hell, there wasn't conversation back in 2019. Like, I never heard these things. I had one podcast that really transformed my life in late 2018. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Michael John Cusick. He wrote Surfing for God. Real powerful stuff. Restored Ministries, I think, is his organization. But so I heard this podcast, and then when I got on the other side, I'm like, damn, there's nobody having these, Frank. Like, and I felt the call, right? Like, you need to start talking about these things. But for you, this was like 20 plus years ago when you wrote this first book. So what was going on then in your life?
Well, let me tell you how it worked. Okay, so I get free, and just the way I mean, look, I had a business I was running. I was doing very well. In my company, I was a bit of a legend. And part of my company, my company kind of helped market things for another company, and so within that company, I was a legend, and people loved what I was doing, and it took all my time, right? So, and besides that, at church, I was teaching pre-marriage classes, I was teaching marriage classes, I was teaching on purity. So, I mean, I was 100% into it. And I was thinking about it and was thinking, gosh, well, who's is somebody going to finally write a book somewhere down the line that teaches the practical things that I knew that God taught me in order to win the battle, because there are literal steps and new habits to teach that, and if we put those things into place, we win. And so I was waiting for someone to write it, and then all of a sudden, uh, I actually started to write back in 86, 87. And as I got finished with the first draft, the Lord said, okay, I want you to put that on the shelf. Now's not the time. And gosh, was I disappointed. It was weird. But I knew I heard his voice. So I just thought, okay, fine. And I just kept working. I kept waiting for someone else to write it. And then in around 97, he says, okay, now's the time. And I wasn't expecting it. In fact, I had put the whole thing out of my mind. I didn't realize he would want me to write anything. And I didn't even I knew I could write. I did well in high school, and in college, but all of a sudden he tapped my shoulder. And so I began to write. And what I focused on most strongly, Frank, is the practical steps, because the last thing guys need is to have someone say to them, just pray about it and God's grace is sufficient for you. Well, I didn't want to stay in my trap and just have sufficient grace to kind of somehow live my life. I'm like you. I'm gonna win or I'm gonna die. And so I began to then put all the things into that book that I lived through and that I learned that really helped me win. And so uh, I guess in some ways, I was the first one to write a book that was very practical, that had the techniques that God taught me in it, that other men could, once you close the book, you can say, okay, I'm going to put these principles into place, and I'm going to find God do the same thing in my life that he did in Fred's. And I don't know about the man you mentioned, Michael, what was his last name?
Michael John Cusick.
Yeah, I mean, he's probably the same way. I mean, he's practical, right? I mean, because if there's anything we know about sexual sin, it's something that really creates bad, even neural pathways in our brain that takes us in directions we really don't want to go. I mean, it's going to take some good, intentional, consistent work to break some of those things and to get free. But it's not like it's complex. We have two main vulnerabilities in our sexuality. One is the visual. Number two is the thing I've been talking about earlier, where not all sexual sin has sexual roots, and some of it's non-sexual. And just figuring out how to deal with those non-sexual issues so that they're not tripping us up anymore. If you can defend both vulnerabilities, you're free. There isn't a third vulnerability. There's just those two.
Yeah, I love the practicality of your approach and breakdown here. As a sports guy, fitness guy myself, like I always talk about, we need offense and defensive strategies, right? I think prayer, maybe scripture, community, accountability partners, defense, right? Like this is going to help you have guards up in place. But the offense, like, how are you changing yourself? How are you changing the way you think? How are you changing the way you see the world? And oftentimes it's the things that you do on a daily basis that create your daily habits. So I love all the practicality behind what you're what excuse me, what you're talking about here, because I think our approach, everything I've done has been exactly the same. And if it was just prayer in Bible that you needed, I don't think 57% of the pastors in the world today or in America would still be struggling, right? And that was kind of the moment for me, is like, well, if you're saying it's just prayer and Bible, then why do the vast majority of Christian men still struggle? Because I'm pretty sure they're praying on a daily basis.
Oh yeah, and in the end, if you think that it's just prayer and yet you keep losing, then pretty soon what does that do to your faith? What does that do to your view of yourself? It's very destructive. And I've had people say to me, well, those practical steps, that's men's actions in a spiritual, men's fleshly actions of setting up defenses in a spiritual battle. And the thing that I always say, Frank, is this isn't all that much of a spiritual battle. I mean, the Apostle Paul said in 1 Corinthians 6:18, flee sexual immorality, because this sin is different from other sins, and you're sinning against your own body. And what what we've learned over the last 20 years in brain studies is that he was absolutely right. It does. You do sin against your own body. You're literally changing the neural pathways in your brain and how you even handle sexual impulses. And we all know that the brain is our largest sex organ. I mean, when we start messing with that, then we start to have some real issues of even being able to have sex with a real flesh and blood woman called our wife, right? And so, I guess what I would just say is that we need to understand that not only the Apostle Paul, but John, Peter, they all said the same thing, that it's up to us to what? Make every effort to be found spotless, right? To turn and to completely give ourselves to holiness, to what's it say in First Thessalonians, that it is God's will that we should avoid sexual immorality and to learn how to handle our bodies in a holy way. Well, learning, that's something that we do. Okay, that's something that we handle. Choosing to make every effort, that's our role. That's our choice. So this isn't just something of, sitting around waiting for God to drop some holy cloud of something around you so that all of a sudden all of your lust goes away. No, this is a discipline. And, the Christian life, a lot of people these days, especially in the progressive movement, they don't believe. They don't believe in discipline. They don't believe in aligning ourselves with Christ, and that is something that is central to who we are. No, I mean, the fact of the matter is, when you read Scripture, it's up to us to stand up and fight, to stand up and be men. What? Fight great battles, live great adventures, defend the beauty in our lives, our wives, our kids. I mean, that is our role as men in this world. And if we're not going to fight big battles and live great adventures, especially in this area of sexual sin, I don't know how we end up, maturing our manhood. We need big battles to fight. We need great adventures to live, or we never do mature as Christians. And part of that is our effort. Part of that is choosing to say, I'm going to be like Christ or die trying.
Yeah, I think it's the John Eldridge quote, right? Like
Yeah,
there's
that's
there's there's
exactly
three
right.
fights that all
He's,
men need. They need a
yeah,
battle to fight, an adventure to go on, and a beauty to rescue, or
yeah.
something along those lines, right?
And,
And I
and
think they
no,
go in
that's
that
exactly
order.
right. And that's where I got it. And I love John Eldridge. He's a hero of mine. I mean, I've never actually met him, but I did send him a message once. And you see, I had one daughter that said that said to me one day, she was just in her teens, but she said, when I get married, I'm going to civilize my husband. And boy, red flags just went up. And I said, you know what? We need to read Wild at Heart together. And by the end of it, she said all the things that used to bug her about guys now actually turned her on. And you see, the thing that we forget is that men are different from women, and that God made men this way to fight big battles for a specific reason, and that's to defend the beauty in not just in their own lives, but on this earth. And without men, gosh, what would this world look like? I mean, there'd be a lot of destruction. And so, because men are the ones that defend. So, yeah, I find this, Frank, that when I look back on my life, I'm 66 now. You're a young, vibrant man, and in some ways, at 66, I feel some level of decline when I compare myself to what I was in my 20s, but I'm still fighting. I'm still working out all those things. But when I look back in my life, the big battle that matured my manhood was this one. That when you take this one on and you win this one, then as you walk out the door in the morning, Satan is kind of going, ugh, Frank's awake. He's out his door. Ugh, Fred's awake. He's out his door. Yeah, because he doesn't have all those ways to grab footholds in our lives and to pick on our families anymore. And it's just the fight of knowing, okay, this is the guy, the enemy that used to own me. He's not going to own me anymore.
Amen to that, man. And I'm turning 40 here in 4 days, and I feel younger, more alive, more vibrant, healthy, ready to do not just things mentally, but physically as well. Like I was at the peak of my bodybuilding career when I turned 30 and I was starting my first business. I got to tell you, Fred, like because I've gotten free from this in these last 4 years, like what I'm going to do this decade is going to trump anything that I did in the last one. And I know that it's been all preparation for this.
Yeah, I love just what you just said because I felt the same thing. When total victory came, I don't have to think about this stuff anymore. It doesn't drain me anymore. It doesn't make me question who I am anymore. I know who I am now. I'm a warrior in God's kingdom, and I can then launch into the things He wants me to launch into. I mean, He basically, I remember one time when I began being an intercession leader at my church where I was the one in charge of all the intercession. And I remember thinking at one point, God, why did you choose me? I'm not, I don't even know that much about this. And you know what his response was? He said, because you got your sexuality under control, I can entrust you now with something this important. Well, that's what we need to think about.
God, that's powerful. That's powerful. Brett, I want to talk about your wife. You mentioned it briefly at the beginning, the role that she played. So for me, I've walked this out as a single man. I'd say probably out of our students that we've worked with, it's probably split down the middle. Of those that are single and then those that are in relationships. And I speak from theories and advice of how to kind of navigate the relationship, right? Because I haven't lived that experience, but I believe that it's the woman's role to support, maybe be there, understand it, but it's not her job to really hold him accountable. What role did Brenda play in it early on for you, and how do you kind of talk about to your work, to your guys out there, the role that the wife and how to get her on board with this?
Yeah, honestly, you know, honestly, back then, Frank, I mean, I thought I was the only one on earth struggling with this. I really did at first. Nobody else seemed to even care about sexual purity. And I would bring it up to my friends, and they would say, well, God understands. He made you this way, and don't worry about it. And I'm just like, ugh, that's not how I want to live. And, but I never even thought of talking to my wife about it. I just engaged the battle, right? I mean, I knew this was undermining my relationship with her on some level. I was still too young of a Christian to fully understand it. I fully understand it now, but I just knew this had to be done. And one of the main reasons was that I had, at that time when I completely engaged the battle, I had a toddler son, and he was I would look into his eyes and I would know he was looking back at me going, "You're my hero. I want to grow up to be just like you." But I'm looking back at him going, "No, don't become like me." And I knew I didn't know how to help him stay out of this prison because I didn't know how. Okay, so what it comes down to is I had to win in order to know how to help him to never lose. Okay, and of course that's exactly how it's turned out. But I really didn't think about involving Brenda as, say, an accountability partner or anything like that. Look, Frank, I'm 66. Like I said, back then the word accountability had never even been spoken. I mean, nobody in the Christian realm was even talking like that. And but here's how she did become involved. Okay, so I told you that there came a time where I began to truly engage this battle and get my eyes and mind under control. And so and one of the things I first did is I looked at the six things that I tripped over the most. Okay, so racy billboards. Um, Believe this or not, as a sales rep, when I would go in to call on companies, the receptionist is always the first person that you get your first impression about a company, and so they would always put a pretty girl out there with really nice clothes. And so I would find myself, she'd get up and go put something into a file cabinet, bend over, and, I would feast on that. Okay, so that was number two. Beer and bikini commercials, football games. And so, and I used to always really lust over lingerie ads in the Sunday morning newspapers. Okay. And I would masturbate over those before church. I mean, it's just an awful thing when you think about it, but that's what I was doing. And so, this is what happened. A lot of guys look at that and say, well, those are small things. They're not small things. Let me finish my story. Because as I began to cut those out of my life, Brenda began to look like a supermodel to me, and I wasn't expecting that. I mean, I didn't know anything. I mean, there were no books, but it was wild. I mean, I started to flirt in ways I hadn't flirted. I'd slap her in the rear and say, "Hey, how about tonight, honey?" All those things, and it was starting to bug her. I mean, she was saying saying to herself, "Well, what is going on with Fred? Does he have an aphrodisiac? I mean, is he having an affair?" And now is trying to show that he's really attracted to me to kind of cover his tracks. I mean, she didn't know what was going on. But about 6 weeks in, she turned on her heels like Clint Eastwood. Her eyes got real narrow. She pointed her finger at me after I patted her one time, and she said, "What am I doing to be so attractive so I can stop it?" I mean, she was just fierce. And I burst out laughing because, first of all, I mean, she's a woman being like Clint Eastwood. That's funny anyway. But the thing is that I suddenly realized I was going to have to tell her what was going on because I really didn't understand. But I knew that, okay, we've got to talk this out. So we just went in and sat on the couch and I told her what I was doing. I was, looking away from joggers, looking away from billboards and all that. And she's not a guy. She's not as visual as we are. And so she didn't even know what any of that meant. She's scratching her head and going, what in the world? Racy billboards. What's he even talking about? But when I got to the point where you and I just talked about, where I'm doing this for my family, I have to be able to know how to keep our kids pure. I have to be able to know that that I'm giving you 100% of my sex life. And when I start talking in terms of the Christian side of it and the building our family side of it, I mean, she was 100% in. She said, "Look, I don't understand most of this, but you know." And I do understand that this has somehow elevated your appreciation for my body. And so you're asking for sex more often because s- here's the deal. I was no longer getting any of my sex drive fulfilled outside of my home, right? And so all of a sudden, all of my sex drive was aimed at Brenda instead of just part of it. And she immediately knew. And obviously, when you're knocking on the door twice as often for sex, of course your wife's going to know. But my point is, she didn't understand what was going on. Now she did. And this is what she said to me. She said, "Okay, I'm in. I will do whatever I have to do to make sure purity happens. I will have sex more often, all those things." But she did say, "Can we kind of get back to our old equilibrium at some point?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm sure we will. I'm just not sure how to handle all this right now." And of course, we eventually did get to a better balance where I wasn't going nuts. And through the years, what she has said is, I am not going to send my husband out into the business world feeling discouraged as a man, feeling disconnected from his wife. And so she's always been very careful to be available to me. Frankly, I have a stronger sex drive than she does, but you could never tell it by the way we live our lives together because here's what Brenda and I believe. This battle is not just every man's battle. I mean, that's the title of my book. The best way to fight every man's battle is as a couple. So we call it every couple's battle. She plays her part, not just sexually. I mean, it's not like, and she's not like a call girl on retainer. I mean, every time I ask for sex, she doesn't say yes, and nor should she. Uh, but we both understand that um, that as we work as a couple to stay sexually connected, there's an intimacy there that helps me to feel good about life. And then I don't need the false intimacy again of masturbation and porn. Do you see what I'm saying?
Absolutely, man. And I mentioned Tony earlier, Tony DiLorenzo. So he works with his wife Alicia, and every time Tony introduces her, talks about her on a podcast or anytime, it's always preceded with the word beautiful. This is my beautiful wife Alicia. Hey, meet my beautiful wife Alicia. He's telling a story about his beautiful wife Alicia, and I asked him about it. Like, why do you do that? And he says, well, for him, their work today started 17 years ago when Tony overcame his pornography addiction. So it was a way for him to reassure to her that she was the most beautiful person in the world. And I said, Tony, that's one part of it. I don't know if you understand what you're doing to yourself, though, is every time you voice it out, you're reconfirming Her beauty is what you want, not the beauty in the magazine, not the beauty that's on the screen. It's her beauty that is the most beautiful in your eyes. So I love that when you got clean and you got on the other side, like I talk about three pillars. You rebuild your body, that's the physical component. You rewire your brain, that's the creating of new neural pathways. And the reshaping of the heart is how you see yourself and how you see others in the world. And I always talk, Fred, about there's a line that we all must walk where you no longer are appreciating, or like you have to be able to acknowledge and appreciate a woman's beauty without participating in it. And that's the guys outside of your, or that's the women outside of your house. But when you stop looking at all this false fake BS that's on the screen, the real stuff, it just gets so much more enjoyable. Same thing with, you get off sugar, fruit tastes a whole lot better, right? So I love that how that showed up in your relationship with her.
And you might find, I mean, you're single, and my son was talking about this when he was single. I mean, he was at Iowa State University, and I said to him, okay, so he was part of Campus Crusade, and he was a leader in Campus Crusade at Iowa State. And I said, son, I walked the campus up there. The women don't wear a whole lot, and you're dealing with a lot of women just like that in camp. I mean, even the Christian girls weren't dressing modestly, just like you see all around us today. I mean, it almost seems like Christian girls are rebelling against the whole modesty thing these days. Not all of them, but it seems to be kind of a weird aberration right now. But I asked him, I said, how do you deal with that? Because you have to deal with these girls on a pretty interpersonal basis when you're the leader of a Bible study and that sort of a thing. And he said, Dad, I just deal with women from the neck up. I don't even deal with them anything below the neck. And we can have great relationship, we can have great intimacy, we can laugh our heads off, but there's none of that other stuff involved. So that's sort of a simple line that I always thought, my son's pretty cool. That's a pretty good way of encapsulating the message that you just mentioned, Frank, in like one sentence.
It's no secret that obviously men and women are different. You talked about it here. You mentioned a couple times. We obviously know men are much more visually stimulated. Women not so much, and that's why this has been a man's problems for decades. But one of the things I think you talk about in the recent book, the new book, is the rise in numbers with young girls. I just was in Atlanta a week ago, and I got brought up for kind of a panel discussion with a young girl that was 23 years old and had already overcome her pornography addiction. She was watching porn, masturbating 4 or 5 times a day as a teenage girl. And this was kind of new insight to me, because obviously we focus in on the men's side of things and understand the male brain is completely different. How is, whether it's technology or just the porn industry is changing to where now we're seeing this massive rise in females getting addicted to it?
Yeah, this is the biggest tragedy I've ever seen because when I was young, of course, we didn't have streaming video. We didn't have any of the stuff that we've got now, the smartphones with 24/7 access to porn. I mean, we had magazines. So there's Playboy, there's Hustler, there's Gallery, all of the ones that were in the drugstores at the time and that I would buy. But the interesting thing about it was this was back in the late 70s. Playgirl magazine went belly up because women aren't visual. They're not going to get excited about a static picture of a naked guy. They just go, put your clothes on. What are you doing? Okay. And so it went out of business. The porn guys, they couldn't understand how to really hook women. The MTV generation began to change all that. And then in time, of course, we began to see that the pornographers began to see that, okay, women are hooked a different way. You see, their sexuality isn't visual, it's relational. And so if you take streaming porn and you tie in a plot line, romantic plot line, let's think in terms of 50 Shades of Grey, but it's all the porn that women are looking at have that kind of romantic theme tied to it. And so that's how they're getting hooked. And let me explain something to you, Frank, that um, I think is going to really help just smooth out why we're in this tsunami with women porn. Men, they've got the two vulnerabilities I talked about earlier, the visual and then the non-sexual roots, okay? And uh, you've got to defend both of those. So women, they don't have, I mean, it's not like women can't train themselves to be visual. I mean, somebody who is looking at porn and masturbating 4 times a day, I'm sure she's a lot more visual than the average girl, right? Because she's trained herself that way. But the fact is, by nature, they're not as visual, and so they don't struggle with that side of it. That's why Playgirl magazine goes belly up. But they have every bit the same vulnerability that we have when it comes to that second aspect of dealing with emotional pain, father wounds, stress, loneliness, disconnection. They get hooked a little bit on porn, and then pretty soon they're using masturbation and porn the same way we are. And here's the first time I faced this would have been back in about the year 2001, 2002, just after Every Man's Battle came out. I went to speak at a Christian college, and I was stunned by what happened there. They did a survey before I got there to kind of find out what the state of the student body was. And what they found was that 100% of the guys were looking at porn at least once a week, which didn't surprise me because we're visual, right? It didn't even make my eyebrow rise. Okay, but then they said 87% of the girls were looking at porn at least once a week. That blew my brain out. I mean, it's like, what in the world is going on here? And what when they dug into it, what they found out is that the girls were going online to see what the big deal is about porn because their boyfriends or guys were doing it. And what's the big deal? Well, this particular Christian college was way out in the boonies, and these kids go to school. They leave all their friends, they leave their parents, they're lonely, they're disconnected. And what the girls were finding is they began to look at that, they begin to masturbate, it starts to medicate that loneliness and disconnection. And they're having then the same sort of addictive behaviors as we are. So, what we're finding today is that women also are not kind of connecting the dots. They want to get free, but they don't understand that the issues are non-sexual at its root. So what we find with women is that most of their sexual addictions is all tied to that same thing I talked about earlier, non-sexual issues, the pain, the loneliness, disconnection, I don't have a boyfriend, all these sorts of things, and that's how they get hooked.
How much of it, you talked about, 50% divorce rate, a lot of men growing up without fathers. I mean, I'm assuming this is going to be the case with women here as well, right? Such the fatherlessness is an issue both on the male and female side.
It's a huge issue. Norm Wright, who again, since I'm older, you've probably never heard of Norm Wright. But back when I was young, Norm Wright was my hero. He wrote things that were unbelievable. And one of the books he wrote, which I would recommend to you, I think is fascinating. And I don't know how much he's updated it over the last couple decades, but it was a book called Always Daddy's Girl. And that book talked about how important the father influence is on women. Now, we all know it's really strong on guys, but when you actually look into how important it is for women to have that father influence in their lives in terms of keeping them from being promiscuous and keeping them away from sexual sin, it's shocking. And I remember reading the book for myself when she was only 2, my oldest daughter, but I remember thinking, gosh, why do I treat her differently than I treat my son? And sometimes I found myself just treating her more harshly than my boy. And I read that book and it changed my life in understanding what the problem was. She thought like a girl instead of thinking like a guy, okay, which is she should. But I would find her in the middle of the night, like dancing like a ballerina in front of her nightlight and just being beautiful and being a princess. And it's just like, for me, it's like, what in the world is going on here? But I began to understand how women are built. I began to understand the importance of a man's influence. And so now when I look back on it from mm, this whole female sexual addiction thing, I realize that, yeah, I mean, 50% divorce rates, the same issues for them where they don't really connect with their fathers on this issue. And of course, so then you have fathers also who are, they're looking at porn. They don't have this thing fixed in their lives. And so then their daughters, they start to they C and D cups, and they're wearing bikinis around them, and dads start to get really uncomfortable, and it makes it even less likely that they talk to them about these issues, and there's almost a drawing away, and women are wounded by that. I mean, my 2 daughters, I got rid of this issue way early. And boy, we used to talk about sexual things a lot. I would go through books with them on these issues, and boy, we can talk about anything. And I think that, again, um, the father's impact is just very huge. And I think the fact that there's a lot of father wounds out there leaves girls feeling disconnected, wounded, and again, running to porn to medicate the pain.
Yeah, what a powerful perspective there, man. Like the uncomfortableness in the father around young girls, maybe in bikinis or just maybe some of the stuff that they're wearing, keeps him kind of bottled up from even being able to go dress. Hey, maybe you shouldn't put that stuff on there, right? It's like, I'm just gonna avoid it, man. I see it in the gym, man, all the time. Like I will see these teenage high school girls that walk in with their parents and are wearing the stuff that like the fitness models are wearing. And I'm like, I just want to go up there and hug the girl because I see a wounded little girl, but I really want to smack the father and be like, dude, we need to have a conversation here right now. God, that's powerful. Really, really powerful share there, Fred. Um, 4+ million copies here of the series here. I know there's multiple books in the Everman's battle, but you and Brenda felt the need to publish a new book, Battle On, Battle Over. What was the genesis story behind this? Why did you felt it was needed to be written today in the world that we're living in right now? And obviously what who's it for and what can the audience expect to maybe learn from the new book?
Yeah, I mean, just like every man's battle, it's written primarily to married couples, although we do have some in the back of the book, we have some open letters to singles and that sort of a thing. And of course,
That's
all the
really good. The
principles.
appendix 3 was really, really good
Oh,
open letter
oh,
to
oh,
the single
really great.
guys.
Thank you for that. Yeah, that's my actually my favorite. That's my favorite chapter of the book is Appendix 3. But I feel so closely to that. But anyway, how this came about was I had never really written on that second vulnerability and the non-sexual roots, even though I lived through it, decades before. But it had never, I just never written on it. I taught on it all the time, and men would come up to me afterwards and say, "Oh my word, you talk about not connecting the dots. Thank you, Fred." So first of all, I thought, it's time for me to really put this down on paper and to teach guys also intimately how to practically step forward into intimacy with God through um, one-on-one worship that I talked about earlier, through fasting, through reading their Bible every day. And, we all know we're supposed to read our Bible every day, but guys don't do it. Well, what I wanted to do is explain why you absolutely have to, because it helps you to build a soul that can actually be a foundation to sexual purity, right? And a lot of us, we build out our bodies like you're talking about. You're a superstar at that. But, my question to any guy is, are you a superstar at building out a robust soul? Because without a robust soul, a lot of these other things will collapse us. I mean, we'll still have the great pecs, we'll still have the great shoulders, all those things. But what good does that do us? Right? When it comes to our marriage or when it comes to our purity. So from my standpoint, I wanted to talk about, okay, that second vulnerability, how we can build out a robust soul that can carry purity, and how that impacts our own destiny, the destiny of our family, and the destiny of the local church. Now, what Brenda wanted to do is she wanted to teach how women can step into their role as a side by side partner with their husband to win every couple's battle, right? And one of the things that we've seen together is that women, because of Hollywood, because of a lot of other things, they have this idea a lot of times where sex shouldn't actually be taken part of unless both people are 100% into it at that moment in time. Well, what Brenda has always believed is that mood, the importance of sex, the importance of sexuality, and that intimate connection in marriage should never be left up to something as transitory as mood. It's way too important. And so, what she's always said is that what she's always said is that, um, even when I'm not in the mood, Fred, once you get started, I get in the mood pretty quick because, women are very much touch oriented. And all I have to do is start touching, and pretty soon she's in the mood. And the reason I burst out laughing is just talked to a guy just yesterday, and he was saying that they have what he calls the 60-second rule in their house. That if he's interested, his wife isn't interested, and she says no, he says, "Give me 60 seconds." And he said, usually within 60 seconds, she's in the mood, right? And so, I burst out laughing at the 60-second rule. I mean, that sounds like some kind of a football game
Yeah, right.
rule, right? But they've got it in their home. And the point is just simply that what Brenda wanted to do is stand up against some of the modern mindsets of how women approach sex, because usually women are they have lesser drives for all sorts of reasons. It's not because they're lesser people. It's just the stresses of family, all these things. It's just difficult for them at times. And we wanted to share some of the best stories that we've ever run across. Pastors talking to their wives about this, and I need you not to be a roommate. I need you to be my lover. Those sorts of things. And so she just wanted to, and I wanted her voice to be speaking to that. I mean, nobody needs a guy to talk to wives about you need to have sex with your husband. I mean, that's the last thing you want. And I don't even have the right perspectives, probably, but she does. And I think she's wiser than me in these areas, and she did a really good job. I don't know if you had a chance to read her chapters, but she did a really good job of expressing God's heart on the matter.
Yeah, I haven't made it all the way through the entire book. I kind of, consumed bits of it that I could, and then there were certain chapters I really, like I said, that appendix 3. I was like, let me really want to dive in there, guys. But we're talking about obviously Fred's new book, Battle On, Battle Over. You can get it at battleonbattleover.com, or you can pick it up on Amazon. We'll get all those links plugged down there in the show notes. Fred, I'd love to ask you one final question before we drive the conversation home. We talked about your sons here a little bit. We got a lot of, lot of young fathers out there as well. We got a lot of, wanting to be fathers here in the future with guys that are fighting their own fight right now. Biggest piece of advice to the men out there that aspire or are fathers right now. Just one practical piece of advice for them out there.
Yeah, I wrote a book called Preparing Your Son for Every Man's Battle. And in that book, I teach men how to connect with their sons on this issue. And it's by going through a book with them. One of the things that most of us don't know is that men, their hearts are reached through story a lot better than through preaching. And one of the things I found with my sons is that if I would go through a book with them, and I'm not talking about something hard, but you'd be reading maybe 6 to 8 pages a day and then just talking to them about it. What I wanted to do through that process is to share the stories from my own life in high school and college, all the mistakes I made, so that usually what we find is that young men, they know the Bible, they know what's right and wrong, but what they don't have is experience. And as a father, what you want to do is share your experiences so they can use those experiences to keep themselves from breaking down. So we call that doing book. I've done book with both my sons and daughters. It changed our lives and our connections together. So
Doing
that's
book,
what.
and
Yep.
would the preparing your son for the battle, would that be the recommended book to start
Yes,
with
yes,
this?
yes, because there's a 10 chapter parent section at the beginning that explains why it works, why doing book is so groundbreaking and connecting. And so yeah, that would be it.
Yeah. Fred, this has been an absolute honor, man. I mean, I mentioned here at the beginning, true pioneer, whether you want to call this industry or space that we're in, it's unfortunate it's here. It's probably not going to go anywhere. We're going to continue to need men that'll level up. We're going to continue men that speak in and to feed into other men. And that's why we really planted our flag here very deep, both with Rebuilt Recovery and the podcast. So great to get connected with somebody like yourself that has been doing this for decades and is really modeling this as a leader, a father, a husband, so forth and so forth. So absolute honor here today.
Well, let me tell you something. It's an honor to be on this podcast because one of the things that you're going to find as you get older, you say you're around 40, okay? When you get to be 60, 65, one of the things that's most important to you is to find men that are picking up the baton that sooner or later I'm going to have to set down because I will go to heaven and I will die, right? And when you're my age and you're looking back, you're you're desperate to see men like you picking up the same baton and running with it as hard as you did. And so thank you, Frank. Thank you. It means a lot to me.
Yeah, thank you, Fred. Anywhere you want to direct the guys here, in terms of you, best site or anywhere you're kind of hanging out socially, where.
I think the cheapest price you'll find for Battle on Battle Over is at battleonbattleover.com. So if you'd like to buy the book, that's where you would go. I also have fredstoeker.com. You find out a lot more about me and some of the other books there. So those are the two websites.
Yeah, guys, and we'll get all that stuff plugged down there in the show notes there for you guys. Make sure to connect with Fred. And definitely, I know most of you are probably familiar with Every Man's Battle. Pick up Battle On, Battle Over. And if you haven't yet, get the updated 20th anniversary edition of Every Man's Battle, because I know you mentioned before we hit record here that you've added some of the newer findings. So both of those guys, we'll get those plugged down in the show notes. Fred, we like to end every conversation here with the same question. The title of our podcast is obviously called The Superhuman Life. For me, when I talk about living a superhuman life, it's a belief system, or it's a way that I try to show up in the world every single day. And I think you and I will both agree that we're here for a purpose. There's a purpose on each single one of our lives. But I think a lot of people stop there. It's right, like God made me for a purpose. It's like, no, how are we being intentional about developing that? How are we being intentional about growing physically, about growing emotionally, about growing mentally, so that we can then bring that purpose to service of others? And that's what I think ultimately makes the world a better place. So that's my definition here, but I'd love to get the guest take. So Fred Stoeker, as we end today's conversation, how would you define living a superhuman life?
Yeah, living a superhuman life is having a tight, interpersonal, intimate relationship with your Father God. And you do that through one-on-one worship and then prayer. And so if you're not doing that, you're not going to achieve your full destiny. You can't, because all that's good, all about your destiny, I mean, he knew your destiny from the beginning of time. You need to tune into him and to lock into him.
Amen. Guys, connect with Fred, pick up both books, battleonbattleover.com. And guys, if you're getting value out of these, we want to thank you again for tuning in here with us. We've seen some really tremendous growth over these past few months. And it's all because of you guys out there doing these two things. So first off, if you haven't done so yet, make sure to leave us a rating, 5-star review, wherever you're consuming this podcast. But most important here today, if there's a guy in your life, maybe it's your brother, maybe it's your friends from work, maybe it's your colleagues at work, do us a favor and do them the blessing by sharing today's conversation with them. But for Fred Stoeker, your host, Frank Chris, we love you guys. We'll see you next week.